The spring of 1845 arrived in Virginia with a gentleness that betrayed the violence simmering beneath its soil. Westerfield Plantation stood like a monument to order, its white columns gleaming in the morning sun, its gardens arranged with the precision of a military formation. Everything had its place, everything followed the law of the house. And at the center of it all stood Eleanor Whitmore, mistress of the estate, keeper of its reputation, guardian of secrets that would make the very foundations tremble. She stood at her bedroom window that April morning, watching the mist roll across the tobacco fields. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman of 38 years, still beautiful in the way that wealth preserves beauty. Pale skin unmarred by labor, dark hair twisted into an elegant knot, eyes that had learned long ago how to hide everything that mattered. Behind her, the bedroom she shared with her husband remained untouched from the night before. Richard Whitmore had taken to sleeping in his study, blaming his cough, his papers, his restless mind. Eleanor knew better. She knew he simply couldn't bear to look at her anymore, though he would never admit what he suspected, what he had perhaps always known. The knock at her door came precisely at 7, as it did every morning. "Mistress Eleanor, your breakfast is ready." The voice belonged to Patience, the house servant who had been with the family since before Eleanor arrived as a bride 20 years ago. "Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories." "I'll be down shortly," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the practiced warmth that made the enslaved people of Westerfield believe she was kinder than most. Perhaps she was. Perhaps that made everything worse. She descended the curved staircase, her hand trailing along the polished banister, her silk morning dress whispering against each step. The dining room smelled of fresh bread and coffee, luxuries that arrived weekly from Charleston. Richard sat at the head of the table, grey-faced and thin, reading a newspaper that was already 3 days old. He didn't look up as she entered. "The Hendersons are hosting a gathering next Saturday," he said, his voice hoarse. "You'll need to prepare something appropriate. They'll expect us to make an impression." "Of course," Eleanor said, taking her seat at the opposite end of the long table. The distance between them seemed to grow wider each year, though they had not moved their chairs. "And the new stable hand arrived yesterday," Richard continued. "The one I purchased from the Thornton estate. He'll need to be trained properly. I expect you to oversee it, since you have such an interest in the horses." There it was, the barb delivered with surgical precision. Eleanor's hand tightened around her teacup, but her face remained serene. "I'll see to it this afternoon." Richard folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness. "See that you do. We can't afford any more irregularities." After he left for his study, Eleanor sat alone in the dining room, listening to the clock tick away the seconds of her carefully constructed life. Through the window, she could see the stables in the distance, their red paint bright against the green fields. Her heart began its familiar acceleration, the one that had been her companion for 15 years, the one that signaled both terror and longing in equal measure. She rose and walked through the house, past portraits of Whitmore ancestors who stared down with judgmental eyes, past rooms filled with furniture imported from England, past all the markers of a life built on the suffering of others. She stepped out onto the veranda, where the spring air carried the scent of honeysuckle and something darker, the smell of the fields where men and women worked until their bodies broke, where children were born into chains, where the very soil was fertilized with anguish. Her walking dress was pale blue, chosen specifically because it could be seen from far away. As she made her way down the path toward the stables, several field workers looked up, then quickly looked away. They knew better than to meet her eyes. They also knew better than to speak of what they had seen over the years, the midnight walks, the lamp that burned in the stable loft long after the horses were bedded down, the children who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The stable stood in a clearing, surrounded by oak trees, whose branches seemed to reach toward it like gnarled fingers. The building itself was well maintained. Richard insisted on it, as the horses represented significant investment, but there was something about the structure that seemed separate from the rest of the plantation, as if it existed in its own pocket of time and consequence. Isaac was mucking out the third stall when she entered. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she saw the slight pause in his movement, the way his shoulders tensed. After 15 years, they had developed a language that required no words, a communication built on the smallest gestures and the heaviest silences. "The new hand arrived," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the way her pulse raced. "My husband wants me to oversee his training." "Yes, mistress." Isaac's voice was deep and careful, each word measured. He turned to face her, and even after all these years, the sight of him made something crack in her carefully maintained composure. He was 42 now, his face lined from years of outdoor work, his hands calloused and scarred, but his eyes remained the same, dark and knowing, seeing through every pretense she erected. "Where is he?" Eleanor asked. "In the tack room, cleaning the bridles." Isaac set down his pitchfork and wiped his hands on his trousers. "He's young, frightened. The Thorntons weren't kind to him." Eleanor nodded. The Thornton plantation had a reputation for brutality that made even other slaveholders uncomfortable. "I'll speak with him." She moved toward the tack room, but Isaac's voice stopped her. "Eleanor." Just her name. Not mistress, not ma'am, but her name, spoken in the tone he reserved for when they were truly alone. She turned back to find him watching her with an expression that held 15 years of everything they couldn't say in daylight. "Thomas asked about his mother again this morning," Isaac said quietly. "Thomas, their third child, now 10 years old, living as an orphaned cousin in the east wing of the main house. Old enough to notice things, to ask questions that had no safe answers. What did you tell him?" Eleanor's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "That his mother loved him very much but couldn't be with him. Same thing I always tell him." Isaac's jaw tightened. "Same lie we've been telling for 10 years. "It's not a lie," Eleanor said, and heard the desperation in her own voice. "I do love him. I love all of them." "Then why—" "You know why." The words came out sharper than she intended. "You know what would happen if the truth came out. They would take the children, they would sell you, they would destroy everything." "Everything is already destroyed, Eleanor. We're just pretending it's not." Isaac took a step closer, close enough that she could see the pain etched into every line of his face. "How much longer can we keep doing this? How many more children are we going to bring into this lie?" Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, where beneath the silk dress and corset another secret was just beginning to grow. The 8th one. She hadn't told him yet, hadn't found the words to explain how, even knowing all the pain it would cause, she couldn't bring herself to stop. "As long as we have to," she said finally, "as long as it takes to find a way out." "There is no way out," Isaac said, and the resignation in his voice was worse than anger would have been. "Not for people like us. Not in a world like this." Before Eleanor could respond, footsteps sounded at the stable entrance. They moved apart instantly, the practiced choreography of 15 years of deception. Isaac picked up his pitchfork and returned to his work. Eleanor smoothed her dress and turned toward the door, her face already rearranging itself into the mask of the plantation mistress. The new stable hand stood in the doorway, a boy of perhaps 16, thin and wary, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Isaac as if trying to calculate where danger might come from. His shirt was torn, and Eleanor could see the marks of recent punishment across his shoulders. "What's your name?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. "Moses, mistress." His voice cracked slightly on the words. "Welcome to Westerfield, Moses. Isaac here will teach you everything you need to know about caring for the horses. You'll find we run things differently here than the Thorntons did. Work hard, follow instructions, and you'll be treated fairly." The boy nodded, but his expression remained guarded. He had heard promises before, Eleanor realized. He had learned not to trust the kindness of white faces. "Isaac, show Moses the evening routine," Eleanor instructed. "I'll return tomorrow to check on his progress." She left the stable without looking back, but she could feel Isaac's gaze following her across the yard. As she walked back toward the main house, she passed the small cottage where 3 of their children lived, disguised as the offspring of a deceased cousin who had never existed. Through the window, she could see Ruth, their oldest at 14, teaching the younger ones to read from a Bible Eleanor had smuggled to them. The sight made her chest constrict with a mixture of pride and terror. That evening, as Eleanor dressed for dinner, Patience helped her with her corset, pulling the laces tight enough to disguise the slight swell of her stomach. The servant's hands were gentle but knowing. Patience had been there for the birth of all 7 children, had held Eleanor's hand through the pain, had carried the babies to their various hiding places throughout the plantation and beyond. She had never spoken a word of judgment, but Eleanor sometimes caught her looking with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow. "The blue silk tonight, mistress?" Patience asked. "Yes, thank you." As Patience helped her into the dress, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a wealthy plantation mistress, refined and elegant, the perfect complement to her husband's position in Virginia society. The image was so complete, so convincing, that sometimes she almost believed it herself, almost forgot the woman who crept to the stables in the dark, who had given birth in secret 7 times, who loved a man the world said she had no right to love. Dinner was a silent affair. Richard barely touched his food, his cough growing worse as the evening progressed. Eleanor watched him across the table and felt nothing but a hollow kind of pity. He had never been cruel to her, had never raised his hand or his voice. But he had also never truly seen her, never asked what she wanted or needed or dreamed. Their marriage had been a transaction, her youth and beauty exchanged for his wealth and status, and both had fulfilled their parts of the bargain without ever touching the truth of who they were. After dinner, Eleanor retired to her room and waited. She waited for the house to grow quiet, for the servants to finish their duties and retreat to their quarters, for Richard's lamp to extinguish in his study. She waited for the moon to rise high enough to cast shadows across the yard, shadows deep enough to hide in. Then, as she had done countless times before, she slipped on a dark cloak and left her room, moving through the house like a ghost. She knew every creaking floorboard, every squeaking hinge, every place where moonlight fell through the windows. She had mapped this journey in her bones. The night air was cool against her face as she crossed the yard. In the distance, she could hear singing from the slave quarters, voices raised in harmonies that spoke of pain and hope intertwined. She moved past them, past the gardens and the fields, toward the stable where a single lamp burned in the loft window. Isaac was waiting for her, as he always was. When she reached the top of the ladder, he pulled her into his arms, and for a few stolen hours, the world outside ceased to exist. Here, in this hidden space, they could pretend they were simply a man and a woman who loved each other, who had built a family together, who had every right to the life they had created. "I'm carrying again," Eleanor whispered against his chest. She felt him tense, felt the war waging inside him between joy and despair. "Eleanor, I know," she said. "I know all the reasons why this is impossible, but it's happening anyway. It's always happening anyway." Isaac pulled back to look at her face in the lamplight. "We can't keep doing this. Every child makes it harder. Every child is another secret that could destroy us all." "Then what do you want me to do?" Eleanor heard the edge of hysteria creeping into her voice. "What choice do I have? Tell me, and I'll do it." But they both knew there were no good choices, no safe paths forward. They were trapped in a web of their own making, bound by laws and customs and hatreds that predated their births and would outlive their deaths. Isaac kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "We'll figure it out," he said, the same lie he had told her 7 times before. "We always do." But as Eleanor lay in his arms that night, listening to the wind whisper through the stable walls, she felt something shift inside her. A premonition, perhaps, a recognition that the careful balance they had maintained for 15 years was beginning to tip. Secrets had weight, and theirs had grown too heavy to hold much longer. Somewhere in the main house, Thomas was probably lying awake, wondering about the mother he had never known. Somewhere in the cottage, Ruth was likely staring at the ceiling, old enough now to sense the truth that no one would speak. And somewhere in Eleanor's own body, an eighth child was beginning to form, another life that would enter the world already marked by the sin of loving across lines that the world had drawn in blood and law. The storm was coming. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, in the way Isaac held her just a little tighter, in the way the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls below. 15 years of stolen moments and hidden children. 15 years of lies built on love. 15 years of pretending that willpower alone could hold back the tide of truth. But secrets, like blood, have a way of rising. And when they do, they drown everything in their path. The Henderson gathering fell on a Saturday in late April, when the dogwoods were in full bloom and the air carried the false promise of gentler times. Eleanor spent the morning overseeing preparations, directing servants to press her finest dress, polish Richard's boots, and prepare appropriate gifts for their hosts. It was the performance she had perfected over 2 decades. The gracious plantation mistress, moving through her duties with practiced elegance, never betraying the chaos that churned beneath her calm exterior. Richard emerged from his study, looking gaunt, his face the color of old parchment. The cough that had plagued him for months had worsened, leaving him breathless after even minor exertion. Eleanor watched him descend the stairs with one hand gripping the banister and felt a complicated mixture of concern and something darker she refused to name. If Richard died, what would happen to Westerfield, to the children, to Isaac? "You should rest," she said, helping him into his coat. "Send our regrets to the Hendersons. And let them think we're weak." Richard's eyes flashed with the pride that had defined his family for generations. "No, we attend. We show strength. That's what the Whitmore name demands." The carriage ride to the Henderson estate took an hour, winding through countryside where spring had painted everything in shades of green and gold. Eleanor sat across from Richard, watching him struggle to breathe, counting the minutes until they could return home. But home meant different things now than it once had. Home meant the main house where she played her role. Home also meant the stable loft where her true life waited in shadows. The Henderson plantation was smaller than Westerfield, but newly prosperous, its wealth evident in the fresh paint and imported furnishings. Margaret Henderson greeted them at the door, her smile bright and predatory in the way of women who collected gossip like currency. "Eleanor, darling, you look positively radiant," Margaret said, taking Eleanor's hands and studying her face with sharp eyes. "Doesn't she, Charles?" Charles Henderson appeared behind his wife, a round man with mutton chops and the perpetual redness of someone who drank more than was wise. "Indeed. Indeed. Richard, you old dog, keeping your bride so well after all these years. What's your secret?" Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good Virginia stock, Charles. Both the land and the lady." The gathering filled the Henderson drawing room with the cream of county society, plantation owners and their wives, lawyers, merchants who had grown wealthy on the cotton and tobacco trade. Eleanor moved through the crowd like a dancer through a familiar routine, offering compliments, exchanging pleasantries, never saying anything that might be remembered or repeated in ways that could hurt her. She was accepting a glass of sherry from a servant when she heard the voice that made her blood freeze. "Mrs. Whitmore, what a pleasure to see you again." Eleanor turned to find Daniel Lockwood standing behind her, and the room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Lockwood was a tobacco merchant from Richmond, a man known for his sharp business sense and sharper tongue. More importantly, he was one of the few people outside Westerfield who had ever glimpsed something he shouldn't have. "Mr. Lockwood," Eleanor managed, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her throat. I didn't know you'd be attending. Last-minute invitation, Lockwood said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I was in the area conducting business, and Charles insisted I join. How fortunate, as I've been meaning to visit Westerfield again. It's been, 3 years since I last stopped by? 3 years? Yes, Eleanor remembered. It'd been autumn of 1842, and Lockwood had arrived unannounced, claiming his carriage had broken down nearby. Richard had invited him to stay for dinner, and during the meal Thomas had wandered in from the kitchen, looking for Patience. The boy had been 7 then, his skin light enough to pass, but his features unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. Lockwood had looked closely. "You must come by soon," Eleanor heard herself say, knowing it was expected, knowing refusal would raise more suspicion than invitation. "Richard would enjoy discussing the tobacco market with someone of your expertise." "Oh, I'm sure," Lockwood said, and something in his tone made Eleanor's stomach turn. "And I'd love to see those children again. The ones you're raising. Cousins, wasn't it? Such a charitable thing you're doing, taking in orphans." The word orphans carried the weight of accusation. Eleanor met his gaze and saw the knowledge there, the suspicion that had been growing for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to bloom into certainty. "Yes," she said quietly. "We believe in caring for family, no matter how distant the connection." "Family," Lockwood repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I'm sure that's exactly what they are." He moved away to join another conversation, but Eleanor felt his eyes on her throughout the evening. She found Richard in a corner, talking politics with a judge from Petersburg, and touched his arm gently. "We should leave soon," she said. "You're not well." Richard nodded, relief visible in his face. They made their excuses to the Hendersons, endured Margaret's dramatic concerns about Richard's health, and finally escaped to their carriage. The moment they were alone, Richard began coughing violently, each hack tearing through his thin frame. Eleanor held him until the fit passed, feeling the bones of his shoulders through his coat. "I'm dying," Richard said when he could speak again. His voice was matter-of-fact, stripped of all pretense. "You know that, don't you?" "Don't say such things," Eleanor replied, but they both heard the hollowness in her denial. "I've known for months. The doctor in Richmond confirmed it." Richard leaned back against the seat, his eyes closed. "Consumption. I have perhaps a year, maybe less." The news should have devastated her. Perhaps once it would have. But Eleanor found herself calculating instead what Richard's death would mean for her, for Isaac, for the children. The cruelty of her own thoughts made her sick, but she couldn't stop them. "I need to tell you something," Richard continued, opening his eyes to look at her directly. "About Westerfield. About what happens after." Eleanor waited, her heart pounding. "My brother William will inherit the estate. It's entailed, you understand. But I've made provisions for you in my will. The house in Charleston, enough money to live comfortably. You'll be free of this place, Eleanor, free of all of it. Free!" The word should have brought joy, but all Eleanor could think about was what would happen to the people of Westerfield, to Isaac, to their children scattered across the plantation like seeds planted in poisoned soil. "What about the slaves?" she asked. "Will William keep them?" Richard's expression hardened. "William will do what he thinks best for the estate. That's not your concern." "But Eleanor," Richard's voice carried a warning. "Whatever else has happened here, whatever I've chosen not to see, I've protected you. I've given you a life of comfort and security. When I'm gone, you'll have your freedom. Don't ask for more than that. Don't ask for things that could destroy you." The rest of the ride passed in silence. Eleanor stared out the window at the darkening landscape, understanding with crystal clarity that Richard knew. Perhaps he had always known. And his final gift to her was the same one he had given her for 20 years, the pretense of ignorance, the protection of silence. But silence, Eleanor was learning, had limits, and protection built on lies was no protection at all. When they arrived home, Eleanor helped Richard to his study and then fled to her room. She paced the floor, her mind racing through impossible calculations. If Richard died and William inherited Westerfield, Isaac would be sold. The children would be scattered. Everything she had built, all the fragile structures she had erected to keep her family together, would crumble in an instant. She waited until the house was dark, then made her way to the stable. Isaac was in the loft, reading by lamplight. Another secret they kept, as teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Virginia. When he saw her face, he set the book aside immediately. What happened? Eleanor told him about Richard's illness, about the inheritance, about Lockwood's suspicions. Isaac listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. "We have to run," he said when she finished. "Take the children and run north. It's the only way." 7 children, Isaac. 8 soon. How far do you think we'd get? Farther than we'd get staying here. Isaac gripped her shoulders. "Eleanor, listen to me. This was always going to end. We've just been pretending we could control how, but we can't. The only choice we have is whether we end it on our terms or wait for the world to end it for us. And if we're caught, they'll hang you. They'll take the children. If we stay, William Whitmore will sell me within a month of Richard's death. You know how he is, Eleanor. You've heard the stories about how he runs his own plantation. I'll be gone, and you'll be in Charleston, and our children will be right here with no one to protect them. At least running, we have a chance." Eleanor pulled away from him, walking to the loft window where she could see the main house silhouetted against the night sky. 20 years she had lived there. 20 years of maintaining appearances, of building a life on foundations of sand. Isaac was right. It was always going to end. The only question was how much she would lose in the ending. "I need time," she said. "Time to think, to plan." "We don't have time, Eleanor. Lockwood is suspicious. Richard is dying. The walls are closing in. Then we make time." Eleanor turned to face him, and Isaac saw in her expression the same steely determination that had allowed her to keep their secret for 15 years. "I won't let panic make us reckless. I won't risk our children's lives on desperate flight with no preparation. Give me 2 months. Let me find safe places for them, establish contacts in the north, gather the resources we'll need." 2 months, Isaac repeated doubtfully. 2 months, Eleanor insisted, and then yes, we run. But we run smart. We run with a plan that might actually work. Isaac studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, when she had been a young bride seeking refuge in the stables from a marriage that felt like a beautiful cage. She had been 23 then, still believing that willpower and careful planning could overcome any obstacle. 15 years had tempered that belief but not broken it. 2 months, he agreed finally. "But Eleanor, if anything changes, if Lockwood comes back or Richard gets worse or—" "Then we adapt," Eleanor finished, "like we always have." She stayed with him until almost dawn, both of them holding each other in the darkness, trying to memorize the feel of this moment before everything shifted. In 2 months, they would attempt the impossible. They would try to take 8 children and flee north, defying every law and custom of the South, risking everything on the slim hope that freedom might be waiting somewhere beyond Virginia's borders. But as the first light began to creep through the loft window, Eleanor thought about Lockwood's knowing eyes, about Richard's failing health, about the secret growing in her belly. 2 months suddenly seemed like an eternity they might not have. The next morning, Eleanor was taking breakfast in her room when Patience entered with a telegram. The servant's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the thin paper. "It came an hour ago, mistress. The messenger is waiting for a reply." Eleanor unfolded the telegram and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Arriving Westerfield Tuesday next. Business to discuss. Daniel Lockwood." Tuesday next was 4 days away, not 2 months. 4 days. Eleanor looked up at Patience and saw in the older woman's eyes the same understanding that had passed between them for years. The servant knew. She had always known, and now she knew, as Eleanor did, that time had just run out. "Tell the messenger there's no reply needed," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Lockwood is welcome at Westerfield whenever he wishes to arrive." After Patience left, Eleanor sat alone in her room, the telegram clutched in her hand. 4 days. In 4 days, she had to decide whether to run unprepared or stay and face whatever Lockwood intended to bring crashing down on them. She thought about her children, Ruth in the cottage, Thomas in the East Wing, the younger ones scattered like seeds she had tried to plant in safer soil. She thought about Isaac, working in the stables, unaware that the timeline had just collapsed. She thought about the 8th child growing inside her, who might never know a world where loving someone wasn't a crime. Then Eleanor stood, straightened her dress, and began to plan. Because if there was one thing 15 years of secret-keeping had taught her, it was that the only way to survive the impossible was to face it with your eyes wide open. The storm was coming, but she would meet it standing. The 4 days before Lockwood's arrival passed in a blur of careful preparation and mounting dread. Eleanor moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, all while her mind raced through scenarios and possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. She couldn't run, not with so little time, not with Richard's suspicious eyes following her movements more closely than usual, but neither could she simply wait for disaster to arrive on her doorstep. On Monday evening, she summoned Patience to her room and closed the door. "I need you to take Thomas and the twins to the Carver farm tomorrow morning," Eleanor said quietly. "Tell Mrs. Carver they're to stay with her cousin in North Carolina for the summer. She'll understand." Patience nodded slowly. The Carver farm sat at the edge of Westerfield's property, run by free black farmers who had purchased their land decades ago. They had helped Eleanor before, hiding children during particularly dangerous visits from Richard's relatives or business associates. "What about Ruth and the others?" Patience asked. "Ruth stays here. She's old enough now that sending her away would raise questions." Eleanor's voice caught slightly. "The others are young enough and light enough that they can pass as what we've always claimed them to be. But Thomas—" She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew that Thomas at 10 was beginning to look too much like Isaac to explain away. "And Isaac?" "Isaac doesn't know yet. I'll tell him tonight." Eleanor walked to her window, looking out toward the stables. "If Lockwood pushes too hard, if he demands proof or starts asking the wrong questions, I need the most vulnerable children away from here." Patience was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years. "You know this can't last much longer, don't you, mistress? All the hiding, all the careful lies, it's like trying to hold back floodwater with your bare hands." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I've always known." That night, Eleanor waited until the house was silent before making her way to the stables. The moon was bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the yard, making her feel exposed as she hurried across the open ground. When she reached the loft, Isaac was standing at the window, as if he'd been watching for her. "I saw Patience take food to the cottage earlier," he said without preamble. "Enough for a journey. What's happening?" Eleanor told him about Lockwood's telegram, about her decision to send Thomas and the twins away. Isaac listened with his jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "You should have told me immediately," he said when she finished. "I'm telling you now. 4 days, Eleanor. We had 4 days, and you spent 3 of them making decisions about our children without consulting me." His voice was low, but shaking with suppressed anger. "Do I get any say in this? Or am I just the stable hand who happens to be their father?" The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. In all their years together, Isaac had never spoken to her with such bitterness. She reached for him, but he stepped back. "I'm sorry," she said. "You're right. I should have come to you first. But Isaac, we don't have time for what? For me to have opinions about my own children's safety?" Isaac's eyes blazed in the lamplight. "You've been making these choices for 15 years, Eleanor. deciding which children stay, which ones go, who gets told what and when. I understand why. I understand that you're the one with the power, the one who can move through the world without chains. But don't pretend I'm your partner in this, when you only come to me after all the important decisions have been made." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "What would you have me do differently? Waste precious time arguing about choices that need to be made quickly? I would have you trust me enough to make them together." Isaac's voice softened slightly. "Eleanor, if we're going to survive this, we can't keep operating like I'm just someone you visit in the night. I'm the father of your children. I'm the man you claim to love. Start treating me like it matters." The truth of his words settled over Eleanor like a weight. For 15 years, she had controlled every aspect of their secret, making decisions unilaterally because she was the one who could move freely, the one whose word carried authority. But in doing so, she had recreated with Isaac the same power dynamic that defined everything else at Westerfield. One person with power, another without it, both playing their assigned roles in a system that destroyed anyone who stepped outside their designated place. "You're right," she said finally. "About all of it, I'm sorry." Isaac studied her face for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms. "I know you're trying to protect them. Protect us. But Eleanor, we're in this together. We have to be, or none of it means anything." They spent the rest of the night making plans together, truly together, discussing options and contingencies. By dawn, they had agreed on a course of action. Patience would take Thomas and the twins to the Carver farm at first light. Ruth would stay at Westerfield, but would be prepared to leave at a moment's notice if necessary. The younger children would remain in their current positions, but with escape routes planned. And Eleanor and Isaac would face Lockwood together, united in whatever deception was necessary to protect their family. "And if the deception fails?" Eleanor asked as she prepared to return to the main house. Isaac was quiet for a moment. "Then we run, all of us, immediately, no matter the risk. I won't let them separate this family, Eleanor. I've lived my whole life in chains. I won't live watching my children grow up the same way." Eleanor kissed him, tasting salt on his lips, whether from her tears or his, she couldn't tell. Then she slipped back across the yard as the eastern sky began to lighten, moving through the shadows one last time before everything changed. Tuesday arrived with unseasonable heat, the kind that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Eleanor dressed carefully in a modest grey dress, pulling her hair into a severe bun. She wanted to look respectable, untouchable, every inch the proper plantation mistress. When Lockwood's carriage appeared on the drive at 2 in the afternoon, she was waiting on the veranda, Richard beside her, despite his obvious weakness. Lockwood emerged from the carriage looking prosperous and predatory, his eyes already scanning the plantation grounds as if taking inventory. "Richard, Mrs. Whitmore, how kind of you to receive me." "Always a pleasure, Daniel," Richard said, his voice raspy but cordial. "To what do we owe the honor of this visit?" "Business, primarily," Lockwood replied, accepting Eleanor's offered lemonade. "But I confess, I've been curious about Westerfield since my last visit. Such a fascinating operation you run here. So many interesting arrangements." The word arrangements hung in the air like a threat. Eleanor maintained her pleasant expression while her mind raced through calculations. What had Lockwood seen? What did he know for certain versus what he merely suspected? Richard led them into his study, where maps of the plantation covered one wall and ledgers filled the shelves. Lockwood spent an hour discussing tobacco prices and market conditions, but Eleanor could feel his attention wandering, his eyes constantly drifting toward the windows that overlooked the stable and the cottage beyond. "I was hoping to see those children again," Lockwood said eventually, his tone casual. "The ones you're caring for. Such a charitable undertaking deserves recognition." "They're at their lessons," Eleanor said smoothly. "I'm afraid they're not available at the moment." "A pity." Lockwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps tomorrow, then. I was hoping to stay a few days if you'll have me. I have some additional business in the area, and your hospitality is far more pleasant than the boarding house in town." Eleanor saw Richard's hesitation. Her husband was ill, in no condition to host guests, but southern hospitality was a sacred duty, and refusing Lockwood without cause would raise more suspicion than it would prevent. "Of course," Richard said finally. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." That evening, Eleanor had dinner prepared in the formal dining room, using the good china and serving the finest wine from Richard's cellar. Lockwood played the part of the grateful guest, complimenting the food and entertaining them with stories from Richmond, but beneath the surface pleasantries, Eleanor could feel him watching, cataloguing, building some case in his mind. After dinner, Richard excused himself to rest, leaving Eleanor alone with Lockwood in the drawing room. She knew she should leave as well, maintain propriety, but some instinct told her that Lockwood wanted her alone, that whatever game he was playing required this moment of privacy. "You have a beautiful home, Mrs. Whitmore," Lockwood said, accepting a glass of port from her. "Richard is fortunate in his choice of wife." "You're kind to say so. I mean it sincerely." Lockwood settled into a chair across from her. "In fact, I've often thought that you're wasted here, buried on a plantation in rural Virginia. A woman of your intelligence and capability could accomplish so much more in a city like Richmond or Charleston." Eleanor forced a laugh. "I'm sure I wouldn't know what to do with myself in a city." "Oh, I think you would. You're remarkably resourceful, Mrs. Whitmore. You've managed to build quite an empire here under Richard's name. The horses, the efficient management of the household, the care of those orphaned children. It's impressive how you've created your own small kingdom within Westerfield." The words sounded like compliments, but Eleanor heard the accusation beneath them. Lockwood was telling her he had been researching, piecing together the structure of her life, looking for cracks in the foundation. "I simply do my duty as Richard's wife," she said carefully. "Duty." Lockwood savoured the word like he had the port. "Yes, you strike me as a woman who understands duty very well. The question is, duty to whom?" Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion erupted from somewhere outside. Voices shouting, running footsteps, and then a child's scream cut through the evening air. Eleanor was on her feet instantly, her heart hammering, every maternal instinct overriding caution. She ran to the window and felt her world tilt. In the yard between the house and the stables, Ruth stood frozen, her arms around a younger child, one of the twins who was supposed to be at the Carver farm. And standing next to them, having just emerged from the stables, was Isaac. In the lamplight streaming from the stable door, the resemblance between the three of them was undeniable. Ruth had Isaac's eyes, his strong features. The twin, barely 6 years old, had Eleanor's colouring but Isaac's bone structure. And the way Ruth instinctively moved closer to Isaac, the protective way he placed his hand on her shoulder, it told a story no amount of explanation could erase. Lockwood had moved to stand beside Eleanor at the window. She could feel his presence like ice against her spine. "My God," he said softly, "how long has this been going on?" Eleanor's mind went blank. All the careful plans, all the practiced deceptions evaporated in the face of this moment. She had been caught. They had all been caught. "I don't know what you mean," she heard herself say, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Don't insult my intelligence, Mrs. Whitmore." Lockwood's voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. "Those children are yours, his children. How many are there? How long have you been carrying on this abomination?" Eleanor turned to face him, and something shifted inside her. For 15 years, she had lived in fear of this exact moment, had built her entire existence around preventing it. But now that it had arrived, she found herself strangely calm. The waiting was over, the pretending was done. 7 children, she said quietly. 15 years. Lockwood stared at her, as if she had transformed into something monstrous before his eyes. 7. 15 years. And Richard knows. Richard chooses not to know. There's a difference. My God, Lockwood repeated, backing away from her slightly. Do you understand what you've done, what you are? I'm a woman who fell in love with a good man, Eleanor said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Everything else is just the world's interpretation. The world's interpretation. Lockwood's voice rose. You've committed adultery with a slave. You've borne mixed-blood children and hidden them on your own plantation. You've violated every law, every moral code, every unjust law, Eleanor interrupted, every cruel code. Tell me, Mr. Lockwood, which is the greater sin, loving someone or owning them? This isn't a philosophical debate, Mrs. Whitmore. This is a crime, multiple crimes. Lockwood's hands were shaking as he set down his port glass. When this becomes known, and it will become known, the scandal will destroy not just you, but everyone connected to Westerfield. Your husband's family, your business partners, everyone. Then perhaps it shouldn't become known, Eleanor said, meeting his gaze steadily. Lockwood laughed, a sharp bark of sound. Are you attempting to blackmail me into silence? On what grounds? I'm not blackmailing you, Mr. Lockwood. I'm appealing to your humanity. Those children out there have done nothing wrong. They didn't choose to be born into this situation. Punishing them for my sins would be the real crime. Your sins? Lockwood shook his head. Mrs. Whitmore, you speak as if this is some minor transgression. You've corrupted the natural order. You've mixed the races. I've loved someone, Eleanor said firmly. I've built a family. I've tried to create something good in a world built on cruelty. If that damns me, then I accept my damnation, but I won't apologize for it. Lockwood stood in silence for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, not kind, but thoughtful. What exactly do you expect to happen here, Mrs. Whitmore? Do you think you can simply continue as you have been? That this revelation changes nothing? I think, Eleanor said carefully, that you have a choice to make, Mr. Lockwood. You can expose us, destroy this family, and feel righteous in your enforcement of unjust laws. Or you can leave Westerfield tomorrow, take your suspicions with you, and allow people who have hurt no one to continue living their lives in peace. In peace? Lockwood's eyebrows rose. You call this peace? Living in constant deception, your children scattered and hidden, never able to acknowledge their own mother. The question hit harder than Eleanor expected, because it was exactly what she asked herself every night in the dark. It's the only peace this world allows us, she said quietly. Before Lockwood could respond, Richard's voice came from the doorway. What's happening here? Eleanor turned to find her husband standing in the doorframe, one hand braced against the wall for support. His face was grey, his breathing laboured, but his eyes were clear and focused on Lockwood. Your wife and I were just discussing family matters, Lockwood said carefully. Richard's gaze moved to Eleanor, then to the window where Ruth and Isaac had disappeared from view. Something passed across his face. Recognition, resignation, perhaps even relief that the charade was finally ending. I see, Richard said. And what conclusions have you reached? The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Eleanor realized with a start that Richard was asking what Lockwood intended to do, and that her husband's response would depend on that answer. After 20 years of deliberate blindness, Richard was finally choosing to see clearly. The question was whether he would protect what he saw or destroy it. Lockwood looked between them, and Eleanor could see him recalculating, understanding that whatever he had expected to find at Westerfield, this moment of three people standing on the edge of truth was not it. I think, Lockwood said slowly, that I find myself in a situation I'm not prepared to address this evening. With your permission, Richard, I'd like to retire to my room and consider the matter further. Richard nodded slowly. Of course. We'll speak more in the morning. After Lockwood left, Eleanor and Richard stood alone in the drawing room, the weight of 15 years of unspoken truths pressing down on them both. How long have you really known? Eleanor asked. Richard moved to the window, looking out at the dark shape of the stables. Known for certain? Perhaps 6 years? Suspected? From the beginning. He turned to face her. Did you think I was truly that blind, Eleanor? I thought you preferred not to see. I did. God help me, I did. Richard's voice cracked. It was easier to pretend, to tell myself I was being generous by ignoring what I couldn't change. But now Lockwood knows, and soon others will know, and there's no more pretending for any of us. Eleanor felt tears finally escaping down her cheeks. I'm sorry, Richard, for all of it. You deserved better than this. Did I? Richard asked quietly. I purchased you, Eleanor, in every way that matters. Your father needed money. I needed a wife to maintain appearances. We were honest about the transaction, at least, but I never asked what you needed, what you wanted. I just assumed your duty was enough. It might have been, Eleanor said, if I hadn't met... Don't, Richard held up his hand. Don't tell me about him. That's the one mercy you can still grant me. They stood in silence, two people who had shared a life without ever truly sharing themselves, finally honest in the moment when honesty could no longer save them. What will you do? Eleanor asked eventually. Richard was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. But Eleanor, whatever happens, you need to prepare for the worst. Lockwood is not a kind man, and even if I wanted to protect you, and God help me, part of me still does, my authority dies with me, and I'm dying faster than either of us hoped. That night, Eleanor didn't go to the stables. Instead, she sat at her bedroom window, watching the lamp burn in the loft, where Isaac was surely waiting, wondering what had happened. She would go to him tomorrow, would tell him that everything had unraveled, that Lockwood knew, and soon the world would know. But tonight, she sat with her hand on her belly, where the 8th child grew, and tried to imagine a future that didn't end in fire and separation. She tried to believe that somehow, despite everything, love might be enough to overcome the hatred the world had built into its very foundations. Outside, clouds gathered on the horizon, promising storms. And in the darkness, Eleanor finally allowed herself to admit what she had known in her heart for 15 years. That no amount of careful planning could save them, that the world they lived in was not built for families like theirs, and that the only choice left was between surrender and rebellion. She chose rebellion. But rebellion, she would learn, came with a price that no amount of love could fully pay. Dawn broke grey and heavy over Westerfield, as if the sky itself knew that something fundamental had shifted in the night. Eleanor rose before first light, her body aching from hours of sleepless tension. She dressed in a simple work dress rather than her usual morning finery, a choice that felt like shedding armor she no longer had the strength to wear. When she descended to the breakfast room, she found Richard already there, staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The morning light revealed how much the illness had ravaged him. He looked like a ghost of the man she had married 20 years ago. Lockwood left before dawn, Richard said without looking up. He took the early carriage to Richmond, no explanation, no farewell. Eleanor sank into her chair, her mind racing. That's either very good or very bad. I suspect it's bad. Richard finally raised his eyes to meet hers. Men like Lockwood don't slink away in the dark unless they're planning something that requires daylight to execute. What will he do? Spread the story, most likely. By week's end, every parlour in Virginia will be buzzing with tales of the Whitmore scandal. Richard's voice was surprisingly steady. Your name will be destroyed, Eleanor. Mine as well. Westerfield itself may not survive the disgrace. Eleanor had prepared herself for this conversation, had rehearsed various responses during the long hours of darkness. But now, faced with the reality of her husband's calm acceptance of their mutual ruin, she found herself with nothing to say. There is another option, Richard continued. It would require you to trust me, which I have no right to ask after 20 years of looking the other way. But I'm asking anyway. What option? Richard pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands and found herself staring at manumission papers. legal documents that would free Isaac and designate him as a free man of color, with the right to own property and travel freely. "I had these drawn up 3 months ago," Richard said. "When the doctor told me I was dying, I started making arrangements. I always told myself it was just good estate planning, but I knew what I was really doing." Eleanor couldn't breathe. "Why?" "Because despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies and the children that aren't mine, I loved you in my way. Not the way he loves you, perhaps, but enough to want you to have some chance at happiness after I'm gone." Richard's voice cracked. "Enough to not want to see you destroyed by my death." "Richard, let me finish." He held up a trembling hand. "The papers are dated for next week, as if I signed them in a moment of charitable impulse before my death. If you and Isaac leave immediately, today, within the hour, you'll have a week's head start before Lockwood's rumors reach their full fervor. The papers give you legal cover for traveling together. You'll be a widow accompanying a freedman north. Scandalous, perhaps, but not criminal. And the children? That's where it gets complicated." Richard pulled out another stack of papers. "I've made arrangements for the younger ones to be sent to a Quaker settlement in Pennsylvania. They run a school for freed children. The papers designate them as my freed property. Orphans I was supporting out of Christian charity. It's weak cover, but it might hold long enough for them to disappear into new lives." Eleanor stared at the documents, her mind reeling. "And Ruth?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Ruth is 14 and looks too much like her father to pass as anything but what she is. If she travels with you, it will confirm every rumor Lockwood spreads. But if she stays here, she'll be sold when William inherits." Eleanor's hands clenched on the table. "Your brother will see her as property, nothing more." "I know." Richard's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't have a good answer for Ruth, Eleanor. I wish to God I did." Before Eleanor could respond, Patience entered the room, her face ashen. "Mistress, there's riders coming up the road. 6 of them moving fast." Eleanor and Richard exchanged a glance. 6 riders moving fast, arriving at dawn. Not a social call. "Wake Isaac," Eleanor told Patience. "Tell him to take the children and run immediately. No questions. Use the route through the tobacco fields to the river. Go." Patience fled without argument. Richard stood, swaying slightly, and walked to the window. Eleanor joined him, watching as the riders emerged from the morning mist, men from neighboring plantations, led by someone she recognized with sick dread, William Whitmore, Richard's younger brother. "He knows," Richard said quietly. "Lockwood must have sent word last night. William wouldn't be here otherwise. What will he do? What men like William always do when they see something that threatens their sense of order." Richard turned to face her. "Eleanor, listen to me very carefully. In approximately 5 minutes, my brother is going to walk through that door and demand that I do something about the scandal you've created. I'm going to stall him as long as I can, but you need to use that time to run. Take the papers, take Isaac if you can reach him, and run. I won't leave the children. The children will be safer if you're not here trying to protect them. Patience knows the plan. She'll get them to the Quaker settlement." Richard gripped her shoulders, his hands surprisingly strong. "For once in your life, Eleanor, choose yourself over duty. Run." The sound of boots on the veranda ended their conversation. Eleanor snatched up the papers and fled toward the kitchen just as William's voice boomed from the entrance hall. "Richard, where the hell are you?" Eleanor ran through the kitchen, startling the cook who was preparing breakfast. She burst out the back door and sprinted toward the stables, her heart hammering, Richard's words echoing in her mind. "Choose yourself. Choose yourself." But how could she choose herself when every part of who she was now was bound up in the children she had borne and the man she loved? The stables were in chaos when she arrived. Isaac was moving quickly, saddling horses, while Ruth helped the younger children into riding clothes. The twin who had been spotted last night, his name was Samuel, was crying, confused by the sudden urgency. "We have to go now," Isaac said when he saw Eleanor. His face was grim, determined. "Patience told me about Richard's plan, but it won't work if we don't move immediately." "Where's Thomas?" Eleanor demanded, suddenly realizing her oldest son was missing. Ruth's face went pale. "He went to the main house early this morning. He wanted to see you to ask about—" The sound of shouting from the direction of the house cut her off. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Thomas was in the house. Her 10-year-old son was in the house, where William Whitmore and 5 armed men were currently searching for evidence of her sins. "I have to go back," Eleanor said, already turning. Isaac grabbed her arm. "Eleanor, no! We can't save him if we're caught too. He's our son." Eleanor jerked free. "I won't leave him." "Then I'm coming with you." Isaac pulled a knife from his belt. Not much of a weapon against 6 men, but something. "Ruth, take the children to the river route like we planned. If we're not there in 30 minutes, go without us." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. At 14, she was already learning the terrible arithmetic of survival. Sometimes you saved who you could and mourned the rest. Eleanor and Isaac ran toward the main house together, keeping to the shadows of the outbuildings. Through the windows, Eleanor could see William and his men moving through rooms, tearing open cabinets, overturning furniture. They were searching for evidence, for proof of the rumors Lockwood had spread. They entered through a side door that led to the servants' quarters. The house slaves had made themselves scarce, knowing that white men's anger often found convenient targets, regardless of guilt. Eleanor and Isaac crept through the narrow hallways, following the sound of William's voice. "Ridiculous accusations, William. Daniel Lockwood is a gossip and a drunk. Then explain the children, Richard." William's voice was sharp, cutting. "Explain the stable slave who looks at your wife like she's his property. Explain why you've been freeing slaves and making elaborate financial arrangements right before your death. I'm a dying man trying to settle my affairs. You're a fool who's been cuckolded by his own property, and now the whole county knows it." Something crashed. William throwing furniture, perhaps. "Where is Eleanor? Where is she?" Eleanor froze in the hallway, her hand finding Isaac's. This was it, the moment when all their careful hiding ended, when the world they had built in shadows was dragged into brutal daylight. A small sound made them both turn. Thomas stood at the end of the hallway, his eyes wide with fear. He had been hiding in one of the storage rooms, Eleanor realized. He had heard everything. "Mama," he whispered, the word he had been forbidden to say for his entire life. Before Eleanor could respond, one of William's men appeared behind Thomas, grabbing the boy by the collar. "Found something, Mr. Whitmore." William's heavy footsteps approached. Eleanor made a split-second decision, pushing Isaac back toward the side door. "Run, get to the children, I'll get Thomas." "Eleanor, go. Please, save the others." She met his eyes one last time, trying to pour 15 years of love into a single look. "I love you. Now run." Isaac hesitated for one agonizing second, then fled. Eleanor heard the side door open and close, heard shouts as someone spotted him, heard the sounds of pursuit. But she couldn't think about that now. She had to focus on Thomas, on her son, who stood frozen in William's grip. She stepped into the main hallway, raising her chin with every ounce of aristocratic bearing she possessed. "Let go of the child, William." William Whitmore was a thick-set man with the florid face of someone who enjoyed his liquor and his anger in equal measure. He stared at Eleanor with undisguised contempt. "So the whore finally shows her face." "I said let go of the child. This child." William shook Thomas slightly. "This mixed-blood bastard you've been passing off as a distant cousin. Oh no, Eleanor. This child is evidence. This child proves everything Lockwood said about you." Richard appeared at the top of the stairs, clinging to the banister. "William, please. The boy has done nothing wrong. The boy is an abomination." William's voice rose. The product of miscegenation and adultery. He should be sold south where no one knows his shameful parentage. He's 10 years old, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. Whatever you think of me, he's just a child. He's property, William corrected. And as of this moment, I'm claiming authority over all property on this estate. Richard is clearly incapable of managing it properly. You have no legal right. I have every right. My brother is dying, and his estate is in chaos. Someone has to restore order. William gestured to his men. Search the grounds, find the slave who ran, and any other evidence of this sickness. Bring them all to me. The men dispersed, leaving Eleanor alone with William and Thomas. The boy was trembling, tears streaming down his face. Eleanor wanted to run to him, to wrap him in her arms and promise that everything would be fine. But she couldn't make that promise. Everything was not fine. Everything was falling apart. What are you going to do with him? Eleanor asked quietly. William smiled, and it was one of the cruelest expressions Eleanor had ever seen. I'm going to make an example of him, of all of them. The children will be sold, the slave will be hanged for his crimes against nature, and you, he paused, savoring the moment, you will live with the knowledge of what your depravity cost them. No. The word came from Richard, who had somehow made his way down the stairs. He stood between Eleanor and William, swaying but defiant. I won't allow it. You won't allow it, William laughed. You're dying, Richard. You have no authority here anymore. I have enough authority to free my own property, which I did 3 days ago. Richard pulled papers from his coat, copies of the manumission documents he had shown Eleanor. Isaac is a free man as of Tuesday last. Legally free. You can't touch him. William snatched the papers, his face darkening as he read. These are fraudulent. You signed them under duress, under the influence of that woman's manipulation. They're witnessed and notarized, Richard countered. They'll hold up in any court. We'll see about that. William crumpled the papers and threw them to the floor. But even if the slave is technically free, it doesn't change what he did. Doesn't change the crime of seducing a white woman, of producing these mongrel children. There are laws, Richard, laws about this kind of degeneracy. Laws written by men who profit from them, Richard said. His voice was growing weaker, his face grayer. Laws that count some people as property and others as gods, with nothing in between. Careful, brother. You're starting to sound like an abolitionist. William's tone was mocking, but there was genuine anger beneath it. Is that what she's done to you? Corrupted you so thoroughly that you've forgotten what you are, what our family stands for? Our family stands for nothing but the profit we've squeezed from human suffering, Richard said quietly. I'm dying, William, and in dying I finally have the clarity to see what I should have seen all along. The courage, perhaps, to say what should have been said. Then say it, William challenged. Say what you really think of this situation. Richard looked at Eleanor, then at Thomas, still trapped in William's grip, then back to his brother. I think love is not a crime, no matter how the law defines it. I think the real crime is a world that would destroy a family for the color of their skin. I think the coughing fit that seized Richard was violent enough to double him over. Blood spattered on the floor, bright red against the polished wood. Eleanor started toward him, but William blocked her path. Don't touch him. You've done enough damage. Richard straightened slowly, wiping blood from his mouth with a handkerchief that was already stained red. The boy goes free, William, and the woman. That's my final decision as master of this estate. Your final decision means nothing. You're clearly not in your right mind. William gestured to one of his men who had returned from searching the grounds. Well, what did you find? The slave got away, sir, made it to the river. We lost him in the woods on the far bank. Relief flooded through Eleanor so powerfully she nearly collapsed. Isaac had escaped. He could get to the children, could get them to safety. Whatever happened to her now, at least they would survive. And the other children? William demanded. Gone too, sir. Looks like they fled with him. William's face turned purple with rage. Every road within 50 miles will have patrols by nightfall. They won't get far, not with a pack of mixed-blood children in tow. They're just children, Eleanor said again, but her voice had lost its strength. She was so tired of fighting, of hiding, of trying to protect people in a world determined to destroy them. They're evidence of your crimes, William corrected. And when they're caught, and they will be caught, they'll be sold to the lowest bidder, deep south probably, separated so they can never corroborate each other's stories. Your legacy, Eleanor, will be children scattered across the south like seeds you should never have planted. Richard made a sound that might have been protest or agreement. It was hard to tell through his labored breathing. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, looking up at his brother with eyes that held both defiance and defeat. Do what you must, William, but know that history will judge you for it. The world is changing, whether men like you want to admit it or not. The world may change, William said, but not in our lifetime, and not because of people like her. He turned his attention to Eleanor. You have until sunset to pack your belongings and leave Westerfield. After that, you're trespassing, and I'll have you arrested. Is that clear? Eleanor looked at Thomas, still gripped by William's hand, tears streaming down his young face. She looked at Richard, dying on the floor, having tried in his final days to make amends for 20 years of deliberate blindness. She looked at the house where she had lived for 2 decades, where she had played the role of dutiful wife while building a secret life in the shadows. Perfectly clear, she said. William released Thomas with a shove that sent the boy stumbling. Take him to the holding pen with the other unmarked property. We'll sort out his status later. No! Eleanor lunged forward, but 2 of William's men grabbed her arms. He's just a child! Please! He's proof of your crimes. He stays. William moved toward the door, then paused. You know, Eleanor, if you had just been content with what you had, wealth, position, respect, none of this would have happened. You could have lived out your life in comfort, but you had to reach for something that was never meant for you. You have only yourself to blame for what comes next. After William left, taking Thomas with him despite the boy's desperate crying, Eleanor sank to the floor next to Richard. His breathing had become a wet, rattling sound. She could see death sitting on his shoulders, waiting. I'm sorry, she whispered, for all of it. Richard managed a weak smile. Don't be sorry for loving someone. Be sorry that the world we built made that love a crime. He coughed again, more blood staining his lips. The papers are real, Eleanor. The manumission is legal. If you can find Isaac, if you can get north, you have a chance. And Thomas? I'll do what I can, but Eleanor. Richard's hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong for a dying man. Some things are beyond even my power to fix. You may have to choose between saving yourself and trying to save him. Choose yourself. Please, let something good come from all this destruction. Eleanor sat with Richard until his breathing eased slightly, until the immediate danger of death seemed to pass. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to her room. She had until sunset. 6 hours to pack a life, to plan an escape, to decide what kind of person she was going to be when the moment of choice arrived. Through her window, she could see the stables, empty now, the door swinging open in the wind. She could see the cottage where some of her children had lived, abandoned now, windows dark. She could see the fields where generations of enslaved people had worked, where her own children had played in secret, where love and suffering had grown side by side like crops planted in the same poisoned soil. The papers Richard had given her lay on her bed, freedom for Isaac, arrangements for the children, one last gift from a dying man who had finally found the courage to see clearly. She packed them carefully in a small bag along with money, jewelry, anything that could be sold or traded. She put on her riding clothes, practical garments that could withstand hard travel. Then she sat and waited for sunset, listening to the house settle around her, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down like a physical force. Save Thomas or save herself? Stay and fight for her son, or run and save the others? Choose between different kinds of failure, different flavors of loss. When the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Eleanor made her decision. She chose rebellion. The sunset Eleanor had been waiting for arrived with the weight of finality. Orange and crimson streaked across the Virginia sky as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. She stood at her bedroom window for the last time, her small bag packed with everything she could carry that might buy safety in an uncertain future. Below, William's men patrolled the grounds, ensuring she would leave as ordered, but Eleanor had no intention of following William's orders, not anymore. She waited until full dark, until the patrols settled into comfortable routine, their vigilance dulled by certainty that a lone woman posed no threat. Then she slipped out through the servants' entrance she and Isaac had used for 15 years of secret meetings. The house staff, those who remained, looked the other way. They had always known more than they said, and in their silence now was a final gift of complicity. The holding pen where William had confined Thomas sat behind the overseer's cottage, a small structure with iron bars that had been built to temporarily house newly purchased slaves before they were assigned quarters. Eleanor had always hated the sight of it, a reminder of Westerfield's foundation in human bondage. Now her own son was locked inside. She approached carefully, keeping to shadows, a heavy cloak hiding her pale dress. A single guard sat outside, one of William's men, half asleep in his chair. Eleanor had anticipated this. Men like William were thorough in their cruelty, but often careless in its execution, assuming their victims had no capacity for resistance. "Excuse me," Eleanor said softly, stepping into the lamplight. The guard jerked awake, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. Then he saw who she was and relaxed slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're supposed to be gone. I'm leaving shortly. But I wanted to say goodbye to the boy first. Surely you can allow me that small kindness." The guard hesitated. He was young, Eleanor realized, perhaps 20, with a face that hadn't yet hardened into the casual cruelty of older men. She stepped closer, letting the lamplight catch her face, knowing that even now, even in disgrace, her beauty carried a certain power. "Please," she said, injecting just the right amount of vulnerability into her voice. "Just a few minutes. No one needs to know." The young guard wavered, then stood. 5 minutes. That's all. He unlocked the door, and Eleanor slipped inside. The holding pen was dark and smelled of fear and unwashed bodies. Thomas sat in the corner, his knees pulled to his chest, his face streaked with dried tears. When he saw Eleanor, he launched himself at her. "Mama," he sobbed against her shoulder. "I'm so scared." "I know, sweetheart, I know." Eleanor held him tight, breathing in the scent of his hair, trying to memorize this moment, because she didn't know if there would be others. "But you need to be brave now. Can you do that for me?" Thomas nodded against her chest. "Are you leaving?" "The guard said you were leaving. Not without you." Eleanor pulled back to look at his face. "Thomas, listen to me very carefully. In a few minutes, there's going to be some noise. When that happens, I want you to run. Run to the river, to the old dock where we used to watch the boats. Your father will be there, do you understand? But no questions. Just run when I tell you to. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded again, his young face trying so hard to be brave. Eleanor kissed his forehead and stood, moving back toward the door. She could see the guard outside, pacing now, starting to regret his moment of kindness. "Time's up, Mrs. Whitmore," he called. Eleanor emerged, closing the door behind her. The guard moved to lock it, his back to her, and Eleanor did what she had known she would have to do from the moment she decided to come here. She picked up the wooden stool he had been sitting on and brought it down hard against the back of his head. The young man crumpled without a sound. Eleanor stood over him, shaking, the stool still clutched in her hands. She had never committed violence before. The act felt both foreign and sickeningly necessary. "Thomas, now!" she called, fumbling with the keys at the guard's belt. But before she could unlock the door, shouts erupted from the main house. Lamps blazed to life. Someone had discovered the guard's absence, or perhaps seen Eleanor crossing the yard. Whatever the cause, her window of opportunity was collapsing. She finally got the door open. Thomas ran out, but Eleanor grabbed his arm before he could flee. "Change of plans. We run together. Stay close to me." They ran through the darkness, Eleanor's knowledge of Westerfield's grounds, guiding them past the main buildings toward the river. Behind them more shouts, the sound of men mobilizing, dogs being released. William would hunt them with everything he had, and they both knew it. The river appeared ahead, black water reflecting scattered starlight. Eleanor's lungs burned, her body unused to this kind of exertion. Beside her, Thomas's breathing came in ragged gasps. They were too slow. The pursuit was too close. A figure stepped out from the tree line ahead, and Eleanor's heart stopped. But then the figure spoke. "This way, quickly." Isaac. He had come back. Eleanor wanted to weep with relief, but there was no time. Isaac led them along the river bank to where a small boat was hidden among the reeds, not enough to carry them far, but enough to put the river between them and their pursuers. "The children!" Eleanor gasped as Isaac pushed the boat into the water. "Safe." Patience got them to the Quaker settlement. They're hidden and cared for. Isaac lifted Thomas into the boat, then helped Eleanor in. "I came back for you. I couldn't leave without knowing." The baying of hounds cut off his words. Closer now, much closer. Isaac threw his weight against the boat, pushing it into deeper water, then hauled himself aboard. The current caught them, pulling them away from Westerfield's shore. Behind them, lamps appeared on the riverbank. Figures running, shouting, pointing. A gunshot cracked across the water, the ball splashing into the river yards away from their boat. "Get down," Isaac commanded, pushing Eleanor and Thomas to the bottom of the boat. He grabbed the oars and pulled hard, aiming for the far shore where trees would provide cover. More gunshots. One splintered the boat's edge near Eleanor's head, showering her with splinters. Thomas whimpered, and she covered his body with hers, trying to shield him from bullets and fear in equal measure. The boat scraped against the far bank. Isaac jumped out, pulling it higher onto shore. "Move! Into the trees! Now!" They scrambled up the muddy bank and into the woods, the sounds of pursuit still loud behind them. The dogs would have to be brought across by another boat or swim, buying them precious minutes. Isaac led them deeper into the forest, following paths only he knew, routes used by people fleeing bondage for generations. They ran until Thomas couldn't run anymore, until the boy's legs gave out and he collapsed against a fallen log. Eleanor's own body was beyond exhaustion, operating on pure maternal desperation. Isaac scooped Thomas into his arms without breaking stride. "How much further?" Eleanor panted. "There's a safe house 5 miles north. If we can make it there before dawn, we'll have a chance." Isaac's voice was strained but determined. "They'll expect us to run north toward Free States. The safe house is actually southeast, toward the coast. We'll hide there until the search moves on, then circle back north." Eleanor nodded, too breathless to speak. They moved through the darkness, following Isaac's lead, trusting his knowledge of escape routes and safe havens. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, the dogs confused by the water crossing. Dawn found them at a small cabin deep in the woods, so camouflaged by vegetation it was nearly invisible. Isaac knocked in a specific pattern, and an elderly black woman opened the door. "Lord, have mercy," she breathed, ushering them inside quickly. "Isaac, what have you brought to my door?" "Freedom, Aunt Sarah, or the hope of it, at least." Isaac set Thomas down gently. The boy had fallen asleep in his arms during the last miles. "This is Eleanor, And this is our son, Thomas." Sarah's eyes went wide, taking in Eleanor's white skin, the obvious resemblance between Thomas and Isaac, the weight of what those facts meant. "You've brought the whole county down on your heads, boy." "I know, but we had nowhere else to go." Sarah studied Eleanor for a long moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "Get in the cellar. There's a hidden room beneath the floorboards. You'll need to stay there during daylight hours. I'll bring food and water when I can." The hidden room was barely larger than a grave, dark and close and smelling of earth. But it was safety, temporary and fragile as it was. Isaac and Eleanor huddled together with Thomas between them, while Sarah replaced the floorboards above. In the darkness, Eleanor finally allowed herself to cry. Silent tears that tracked down her face, washing away 15 years of careful composure. Isaac found her hand in the dark and held it. "We made it," he whispered. "All three of us. We made it." "For now," Eleanor said. "But Isaac, they won't stop hunting us. William won't stop. The whole machinery of law and custom will grind us down eventually. Then we'll stay ahead of it." Isaac's voice held a determination Eleanor had never heard before. "We'll reach free soil. We'll find the other children. We'll build a life." "How?" The question came out broken, defeated. "How do we build anything when the whole world wants to destroy us?" Isaac was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every enslaved person who had ever asked that same question. "The same way my people have always built things in this country, Eleanor. Piece by piece, in the cracks they leave us, with hope as our foundation and love as our mortar. It's not much, but it's all we've ever had." Thomas stirred between them, murmuring in his sleep. Eleanor stroked his hair and thought about the other children, Ruth and the twins, the younger ones, the baby not yet born that she carried, scattered like seeds across a landscape that wanted nothing more than to prevent them from taking root. "Tell me about the Quaker settlement," she said. "Tell me they're really safe." Isaac described a community of abolitionists who had been sheltering fugitives for years, who had systems and networks and genuine commitment to the cause of freedom. He painted a picture of hope that Eleanor wanted desperately to believe in. "Patience stayed with them," Isaac added. "She said she'd watch over them until we could reunite. She said—" His voice caught. "She said after all these years of keeping our secret, she'd earned the right to help keep our children safe." Eleanor thought of Patience, the house servant who had delivered all 7 children, who had carried their secrets with dignity and discretion, who had chosen at the end to throw her own safety away for their sake. Another life disrupted by Eleanor's choices, another casualty of love in a time that weaponized compassion. Above them, they heard Sarah moving around the cabin, going through the motions of a normal day. To any searchers who might arrive, she would be just another elderly black woman, living alone, bothering no one. They would search her cabin, perhaps, but the hidden room had been built with expertise born of necessity. Generations of people had hidden in spaces like this, breathing shallow, praying silent, waiting for the sound of pursuit to fade. Days blurred together in the darkness. Sarah brought them food and water, whispered updates about the search. William had indeed raised the whole county, offering a reward for their capture that made Eleanor sick to imagine. Wanted posters had been distributed, describing Isaac as a dangerous fugitive, Eleanor as a woman of questionable sanity who had been kidnapped, Thomas as stolen property. "They're rewriting the story," Eleanor said when Sarah relayed this news, "making me a victim instead of a willing participant, making Isaac the villain instead of—" She trailed off, unable to find words. "Instead of a man who loved you," Isaac finished quietly. "Yes, that's always how they write these stories. They can't imagine we have the same hearts they do. Easier to make me a monster than accept that you chose me." On the fifth night in hiding, Sarah brought news that the search had moved north, following false leads planted by sympathizers on the Underground Railroad. "You can leave tomorrow night," she said. "I have a contact who runs goods to the coast. He'll hide you in his wagon, get you to a port town. From there you can try to book passage on a ship north." "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay—" "Don't thank me yet." Sarah's expression was grave. "The road ahead is longer than you know, child. Reaching free soil doesn't end your troubles. You'll still be a white woman with a black man and mixed children in a world that hates that combination. You'll still be running, just in different ways." "I know," Eleanor said, "but at least we'll be running together." The journey to the coast took 3 days, hidden beneath burlap sacks in a freight wagon, while the driver made his deliveries. Thomas handled it with the resigned bravery of a child who had learned too young that the world was cruel. Isaac held Eleanor when the fear became too much, when the close darkness and uncertain future threatened to crush her spirit. They reached the port town of Norfolk just as Eleanor's money ran out. The ship captain who agreed to take them was a grizzled New Englander with abolitionist sympathies and a willingness to look the other way for the right price. "Massachusetts," he said, counting Eleanor's last coins. "That's as far as this gets you. After that, you're on your own." They boarded at night, staying below deck in a cramped space that smelled of salt and rotting fish. As the ship pulled away from Virginia's shore, Eleanor stood at a small porthole, watching the land recede. Somewhere back there was Westerfield, burning now in her imagination, though she didn't know if William had actually destroyed it. Somewhere back there was Richard, dying or perhaps already dead, having spent his last strength trying to atone for 20 years of chosen blindness. Somewhere back there were the pieces of a life she had built in shadows, now scattered and broken, leaving only these 3 survivors, herself, Isaac, and Thomas, to carry forward. "What will we do in Massachusetts?" Thomas asked, his hand in hers. Eleanor looked at Isaac, seeing in his eyes the same uncertainty she felt. But she also saw determination and love, and the stubborn hope that had sustained generations of his people through horrors worse than anything she could imagine. "We'll find your brothers and sisters," she said to Thomas. "We'll build a home. We'll live as a family, openly, the way we always should have. Will it be safe?" Eleanor thought about Sarah's warning, about the long road ahead, about the reality that even free soil wouldn't free them from hatred and fear. But she also thought about Ruth and the twins, about Patience watching over them, about the 8th child growing inside her who might actually be born into something resembling freedom. "Safe enough," she said finally. "It has to be safe enough, because the alternative is unthinkable." The ship sailed north through waters that divided slave states from free. Eleanor spent hours on deck when she could, breathing air that felt different somehow, as if freedom had a scent she was just learning to recognize. Isaac stood beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness, both of them staring toward a future they could barely imagine. "I love you," Eleanor said into the wind. "I should have said it more. All these years, hiding in shadows, I should have said it every day." "You showed it," Isaac replied. "Every time you came to the stables, every time you bore another child knowing the danger, every time you chose us over the life you could have had. I felt loved, Eleanor. I always felt loved. But was it enough? All that love, and look what it cost. 7 children scattered, 1 dead husband, a plantation in ruins, lives destroyed." "Stop." Isaac turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "We are not responsible for a world that made love a crime. We are only responsible for loving as best we could in the world we were given. Whatever comes next, we face it knowing we chose each other, chose our children, chose truth over lies. That has to be enough. It's all we have." Behind them, Thomas had fallen asleep on a coil of rope, exhausted by fear and hope in equal measure. Above them, Stars wheeled in patterns that cared nothing for human laws or human suffering, and ahead, invisible in the darkness, lay Massachusetts and reunion, and the terrifying possibility of a life lived without hiding. The ship sailed on, carrying 3 fugitives toward freedom, toward family, toward the future they would build from the ashes of the one that had burned behind them. Massachusetts arrived on a grey October morning, the port of Boston emerging from fog like something from a dream. Eleanor stood on deck with Thomas pressed against her side, both of them staring at the city that would either save them or simply provide new ways to destroy them. Isaac stood slightly behind, as they had agreed. In public, they would maintain distance, would pretend to be mistress and freedman, would hide their true relationship until they were safely beyond prying eyes. The pretense tasted like ashes after everything they had survived, but caution had kept them alive this long. The ship's captain helped them disembark, pressing a slip of paper into Isaac's hand. Address of a boarding house that doesn't ask questions. Tell Mrs. Abernathy that Captain Mills sent you. She'll find you discreet lodging. The boarding house sat in a narrow street near the docks, a weathered building that leaned slightly to one side. Mrs. Abernathy was a sharp-eyed widow who took one look at the 3 of them and understood immediately what they needed. 2 rooms, she said firmly. The lady in one, the man and boy in another. What folks think is their own business, but what I provide is respectability. You understand? Eleanor understood. Even here, even in free Massachusetts, they would have to hide, just differently, more carefully, with new layers of deception to replace the old ones. The first weeks passed in a blur of desperation and searching. Eleanor sold her remaining jewelry to fund their stay and purchase information. The Quaker settlement, where Patience had taken the children, was in western Massachusetts, a 3-day journey by coach. But winter was approaching, and traveling with Thomas would raise questions they couldn't safely answer. "I'll go," Isaac said one evening in Eleanor's room, speaking low, though the walls were thick enough for privacy. "I'll bring them back. You and Thomas stay here where it's safe." "We don't separate again," Eleanor insisted. "Not after everything. We travel together or not at all." They argued about it for days, both stubborn, both terrified of making the wrong choice. It was Thomas who finally settled it. "Papa should go," the boy said quietly one evening. "He can move faster alone, and if something happens, if they catch him, at least Mama and I will still be here to help the others." The brutal pragmatism of a 10-year-old child planning for his father's potential capture made Eleanor want to weep. But Thomas was right, and they all knew it. Isaac could travel as a freedman doing seasonal work, unremarkable and easily overlooked. Eleanor and Thomas traveling together would always draw attention. Isaac left on a cold November morning. Eleanor stood at her window watching him walk away down the street, his papers tucked in his coat, his freedom official but fragile. She had learned over 15 years that love sometimes meant letting go, even when every instinct screamed to hold tighter. The waiting was agony, days stretched into weeks with no word. Eleanor tried to occupy herself with Thomas's education, teaching him to read and write properly, introducing him to a world of books that would have been forbidden in Virginia. But at night, alone in her room, she imagined 100 disasters. Isaac caught, arrested, returned south in chains, hanged for the crime of loving her. The 8th child made itself increasingly known. Eleanor's body was changing in ways she could no longer hide beneath loose dresses. Mrs. Abernathy noticed, her eyes going to Eleanor's waist with unmistakable understanding. "The baby's father," she said one afternoon over tea. "He's the freedman, isn't he?" Eleanor considered lying, but she was so tired of lies. "Yes." Mrs. Abernathy was quiet for a long moment. "I won't judge you, Mrs. Whitmore. Lord knows I've seen stranger things in this city. But you should know that even here, even in Massachusetts, such things cause talk that could bring the wrong kind of attention. "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "I've spent 15 years learning exactly how much attention such things can bring." "Then you know you'll need to be careful. This city has abolitionists who'll help you, but it also has people who profit from returning fugitives south. The new law makes it even more dangerous." Eleanor knew about the Fugitive Slave Act that had passed that September, knew it meant that even free soil was no longer truly free. Slave catchers could operate openly in northern states now, could demand the return of anyone suspected of being fugitive property. The law had turned the entire country into hunting grounds. "If someone comes looking for us?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Abernathy's expression hardened. "Then I'll tell them I run a respectable establishment and know nothing about your private affairs. But Mrs. Whitmore, they don't need to find you here. Your husband's brother has deep pockets, from what you've told me. Men with deep pockets can reach anywhere." The warning settled over Eleanor like a shroud. They had run from Virginia, had risked everything for this moment of freedom. But the reach of slavery was long and growing longer. Even here, even now, they weren't safe. Isaac returned on a snowy evening in early December, and Eleanor knew from his face that something had gone wrong. He entered her room with snow melting in his hair, his expression devastating. "The settlement was raided 2 weeks ago," he said without preamble. "Slave catchers operating under the new law. They took anyone who couldn't prove they were born free." Eleanor felt the room tilt. The children? Patience hid them. She had warning, managed to get them to another safe house before the raid. But Eleanor, they can't stay in Massachusetts anymore. It's not safe. Nowhere in America is safe. "Then where?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Where can we possibly go?" Isaac pulled a chair close to hers, taking her hands. "Canada. There are settlements there. Communities of freed slaves and fugitives. The British don't recognize slavery. If we can get across the border, we'd actually be safe." "Canada," Eleanor repeated, trying to imagine it. Another flight, another desperate journey, this time in winter with children and a pregnancy growing increasingly obvious. How? "There's a route, a conductor on the railroad who specializes in moving families north, but it's expensive and dangerous, and there are no guarantees." "There have never been guarantees," Eleanor said. "Not from the beginning. When can we leave?" They made their preparations in secret, selling everything Eleanor had left of value, booking passage on a freight train that would take them to Vermont. From there, they would have to cross the border on foot, guided by a conductor whose name they would only learn at the last moment. The night before their departure, Eleanor stood at her window looking out at Boston's snow-covered streets. She thought about Virginia, about Westerfield burning in her imagination, about Richard dead by now surely, about the life she had left behind. Part of her mourned it, the comfort, the security, the illusion of control. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger through each flight and each reunion, felt only relief that the pretending was finally, truly over. Thomas appeared at her door, unable to sleep. "Maman, will it always be like this, always running?" Eleanor pulled him close, running her fingers through his hair. "I don't know, sweetheart, I hope not. I hope someday you'll be able to stop, to put down roots, to live without fear. But even if we have to run forever, we do it together. That's what matters." "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Loving Papa? Having us?" The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Did she regret it? Did she regret the choice that had cost her everything, that had destroyed lives and scattered her children and turned her into a fugitive? Did she regret loving Isaac? "Never," she said fiercely. "Not for 1 second. You and your brothers and sisters are the best things I ever did with my life. Loving your father is the only choice I ever made that was truly mine. Everything else was just playing a role the world assigned me. This love, this family, this is real." The train to Vermont left before dawn. They traveled in a livestock car, hidden among crates of goods, Eleanor's pregnancy making the cramped quarters even more uncomfortable. Isaac held her steady as the train rattled north, his arms a constant presence in the darkness. At the Vermont border, they met their conductor, a severe-looking Quaker woman named Sarah Grimke, who studied them with sharp, assessing eyes. "You'll be traveling with another family," she informed them. "A mother and 3 children, also fleeing the new law. The group will be safer than individuals." The other family was waiting at a farmhouse outside town. Ruth, Eleanor realized with shock. Ruth and the twins, and one of the younger children, her children. Patience had gotten them north after all. Ruth saw Eleanor and flew into her arms, 14 years of separation and secrecy breaking in a flood of tears. "Mama, Mama, you came." "Of course I came," Eleanor sobbed. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" That night, Eleanor counted her children. Ruth, Thomas, the twins Samuel and Rebecca, 8-year-old Grace. 5 of the 7 here, safe for now. The other 2 were in different safe houses, Sarah explained, too far to collect before the border crossing. But there were people working to reunite them, networks of conductors and safe houses dedicated to keeping families together. "Where's Patience?" Eleanor asked Ruth. Ruth's face clouded. "She stayed behind to help other families. She said her place was in the network, helping people like us. She said—" Ruth's voice broke. "She said she'd carried enough secrets for one lifetime. Now she was going to help make sure other secrets made it to freedom." Patience, Eleanor thought of the woman who had delivered all 7 children, who had kept every secret, who had finally chosen to risk everything not for her own freedom, but to help others find theirs. Another casualty of love in a time that weaponized compassion, another hero in a struggle that would outlive them all. The crossing was planned for 3 nights hence, waiting for a snowstorm that would hide their tracks and discourage patrols. Sarah drilled them in the route, the contingency plans, the signals they would use if they encountered danger. Eleanor listened and tried to commit everything to memory, while her body grew heavier with the 8th child, a constant reminder that time was running out for caution. The night of the crossing arrived with howling wind and snow that cut like knives. Sarah led them out into the storm, a line of 7 people connected by rope, moving through darkness toward a border that existed only on maps and in the hearts of men who believed some humans were property and others were free. Halfway across a frozen river, Eleanor's water broke. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, doubling her over, the cold forgotten in the face of her body's urgent message. Isaac caught her before she fell, his arms strong around her, his voice in her ear telling her to breathe, to hold on. They were so close. "We have to stop," he shouted to Sarah over the wind. "The baby's coming." Sarah turned back, her face grim. "We're in the middle of the border crossing. If we stop now, in this storm we all die. Can she make it to the other side?" Eleanor wanted to scream that no, she couldn't, that her body was breaking open right here in the middle of a frozen river, that this was impossible. But she thought about Ruth and Thomas and the twins and Grace, all watching her with terrified eyes, and she nodded. "I can make it." The next hour was agony measured in yards, each step a negotiation between her body's demands and her will's refusal. Isaac half carried her, Ruth and Thomas supporting from the other side, the children trailing behind like a fragile chain of hope. The snow covered their tracks as quickly as they made them, erasing all evidence of their passage. They reached the far shore just as Eleanor's legs gave out completely. Sarah led them to a small cabin, hidden among the trees, Canadian soil technically, though it looked no different than the American side of the river. "Is there a midwife?" Isaac asked desperately. "I'm the closest you'll get," Sarah replied, already building up the fire. "I've brought enough babies into this world. Get her inside." Eleanor barely registered being moved, being laid on a rough bed, being told to push when her body was already pushing whether she willed it or not. She was dimly aware of Ruth holding her hand, of Thomas's scared face in the doorway, of Isaac's voice telling her she was brave, she was strong, she could do this. The eighth child entered the world screaming defiance at the cold and the dark and the injustice of being born to fugitive parents on the wrong side of too many borders. A girl, Sarah announced, healthy and furious and alive. Eleanor held her daughter and wept. This child would never know Virginia, would never know Westerfield or the stables where her parents had loved in secret, would never have to hide who her father was or pretend her mother didn't exist. This child was born free, truly free, in a country that wouldn't try to separate her from her family. "What will you name her?" Sarah asked. Eleanor looked at Isaac, at their children gathered around the bed, at the tiny face of this newest addition to their impossible family. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." They stayed in the cabin for a week while Eleanor recovered and Hope grew strong enough to travel. Then Sarah helped them reach a settlement of formerly enslaved people outside Toronto, a community that had built itself from nothing but determination and mutual support. The settlement welcomed them with a kindness Eleanor had forgotten existed. People who had made similar journeys, who understood the cost of freedom, who asked no questions about the white woman with the black husband and the 7 mixed children. They were given a small house, help finding work, connections to other settlements, where Eleanor's remaining 2 children were being sheltered. Winter passed into spring. Isaac found work as a carpenter, skills he had learned in Westerfield stables, now supporting his family in freedom. Eleanor taught the settlement's children to read and write, passing on the education she had received in that other life. The children grew and thrived, no longer having to hide who they were or whose they belonged to. But some nights, Eleanor would wake from dreams of fire, of Westerfield burning, of Richard dying alone, of all the people who had been caught in the machinery of their choices. She would lie in the darkness next to Isaac, listening to him breathe, feeling the weight of hope sleeping between them, and wonder if the price had been worth it. "Yes," Isaac would say when she voiced these doubts. "Whatever the price was, yes. Look at our children, Eleanor. Look at how they live without fear. That's worth everything we lost. That's worth everything we had to become." A year after their arrival in Canada, Ruth began attending a school for colored children, the first formal education she had ever received. She was brilliant, her teacher reported, hungry for knowledge that had been denied her for 14 years. Eleanor watched her oldest daughter flourish and felt something in her chest loosen, hope, perhaps, that breaking cycles was possible. 2 years after their arrival, Eleanor's other 2 children were finally brought north by conductors on the railroad. The reunion was joyous and heartbreaking, as the children struggled to recognize a mother they barely remembered, and siblings they had been separated from for so long. But slowly, painstakingly, they built relationships, created family from the fragments that had been scattered. 3 years after their arrival, Ruth brought home a young man she wanted to marry, a freedman whose family had escaped bondage a generation earlier. Eleanor watched her daughter plan a wedding that would be legal and recognized, that no law could invalidate or destroy, and felt tears of gratitude that at least one of her children would never have to hide love the way she had. 5 years after their arrival, word reached them from Virginia. William Whitmore had died, the estate sold to pay debts, Westerfield itself abandoned and falling to ruin. The world that had made their love a crime was slowly crumbling, though not fast enough, never fast enough. 10 years after their arrival, Isaac took sick. It was sudden and brutal, a fever that burned through him in a matter of days, leaving Eleanor helpless to do anything but hold his hand and whisper all the things she should have said louder, more often, during their years together. "No regrets?" she asked him on the last day, when they both knew he was dying. Isaac smiled, the same smile that had captivated her 15 years earlier in a stable in Virginia. "Not one. We built something beautiful, Eleanor. Against impossible odds, we built a family. We loved each other. We survived long enough to see our children free. That's more than most people get in a lifetime." After Isaac died, Eleanor thought the grief might kill her. But her children needed her. And their children, grandchildren now, a third generation born free, needed the stories only she could tell. So she lived and loved and carried the weight of memory. She lived to see Ruth become a teacher, to see Thomas become a minister, serving the settlement's church, to see the twins open a shop together. She lived to see Hope, the child born on the border between bondage and freedom, grow into a fierce advocate for women's rights, carrying forward her mother's stubborn refusal to accept the world's limitations. She lived to see the Civil War end slavery in America, though it came too late for Isaac, too late for patience, too late for all the people who had died waiting for freedom. And when Eleanor finally died at 73, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her last words were for Isaac, for the man who had been invisible to the world but had been everything to her. "I chose you," she whispered. "I would choose you again. Every time in every life I would choose you." Years later, when the story of Westerfield reached historians studying the antebellum South, they found references to the scandal. The plantation mistress who had borne children with her slave, the dramatic escape, the family that had fled to Canada. Some wrote about it as a cautionary tale of moral decay and social transgression. Others saw it as evidence of love's capacity to transcend even the most brutal systems of oppression. But in the settlement outside Toronto, where Eleanor's descendants still lived, the story was told differently. There, it was a story about a woman who chose love over law, who risked everything for her family, who refused to accept the world's definition of who she could be and whom she could love. There, it was a story about 7 children scattered like seeds, taking root in free soil, growing into a family tree that would spread across continents and generations. There, it was a story about Isaac, who loved a woman the world said he had no right to love, who raised children he had no legal claim to, who died free and buried in earth that couldn't be sold beneath him. They called it sin. The earth called it truth. And history called it the scandal that burned the South from within. But Eleanor's great-great-grandchildren, born free, born equal, born into a world still imperfect but inching toward justice, called it what it had always been: love. Just love. In the end, that had to be enough. It was all they'd ever had. It was everything they'd ever needed.